Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into a really tough topic this time around. Um,
Yeah.
why people stay in abusive relationships.
It's a question that we get a lot, but
Yeah,
there are a lot of misconceptions around it.
definitely. So to help us kind of unpack all of this, we've got this whole stack of articles here, even a Reddit thread with personal stories from a bunch of different sources. The One Love Foundation, Psych Central, Psychology Today, the Institute for Family Studies.
It's going to be really interesting to look through all of this and see what we can pull out.
Yeah, looking forward to it. So I guess to just jump right in, probably the most common question that people have is, why don't they just leave?
Right. And it seems so simple, doesn't it? Like, just leave. But
Yeah.
the truth is that that is a very dangerous way to look at it.
Right. And it can actually be incredibly dangerous for the person in the relationship too, right?
Exactly. Leaving is probably the most dangerous time for someone in an abusive relationship.
So you can't just tell people to leave.
Not at all.
That's not the answer.
In fact, the One Love Foundation says that women are 70 times more likely to be killed in the weeks after they leave their abuser.
Wow, 70 times.
That's a terrifying statistic, and it shows just how much control and manipulation happens in these situations.
That's chilling. So I'm seeing a lot of different things highlighted in these sources. Fear, denial, low self-esteem.
Right, and it might help to break these reasons down into like two categories, kind of the emotional side of it and the situational side of it.
Okay.
So when we're talking about the emotional reasons, these are kind of like the internal things that make leaving so hard, like fear, for example, that you mentioned. And it's not just fear for physical safety, although that is definitely part of it.
Yeah, I mean, reading through some of these Reddit posts, it's heartbreaking. You see people talking about fears of what's going to happen to their families, retaliation, even like worry about what will happen to the abuser if they leave.
Exactly. It's all these different kinds of fear, and it gets all tangled up, and people just feel trapped.
Completely trapped.
And then you've got the impact on self-esteem. Abuse can be so sneaky because it slowly takes away your sense of worth,
Yeah.
until you start to actually believe that you deserve this treatment.
It's crazy how that can happen. And I think this quote from Psych Central really sums it up. You may believe you've done something wrong or that the violence is your fault.
Yeah, I mean, how messed up is that?
It really is. To think that somebody could actually believe that because of what this other person is doing to them.
It's like they're brainwashed or something.
Yeah, pretty much. It makes it so much harder for someone to see their own value or even that they deserve to be safe.
Right. And then there's denial. And that can be particularly hard when the abuse isn't physical.
Yeah, so like emotional abuse or financial abuse. I saw on the Reddit thread that somebody said, I didn't think that emotional and financial abuse was really abuse because words don't leave bruises.
Wow.
That's powerful.
Yeah. That shows just how hard it can be to even recognize some forms of abuse.
Totally. So far we have fear, low self-esteem, and denial. What other kinds of things are there?
Well, guilt and shame come up a lot, too. The Institute for Family Studies mentioned that many victims actually feel responsible for how the abuser is acting.
Really?
Yeah, or they're ashamed to even admit it's happening. They either blame themselves or think they need to protect the abuser from consequences.
It's like this misplaced sense of obligation. And especially for women, it seems like there's all this pressure from society to be the caretaker, the one that fixes everything.
That's so true. It's almost like we're raised to think we have to put other people's needs ahead of our own, even if it's hurting us.
Right.
Yeah.
Like there's that old saying, behind every great man is a great woman. But what if being that great woman means that she's not safe or happy?
Exactly. And that actually connects to another big one, hope.
Hope for change.
Yeah, the hope that things will go back to how they were, that the abuser will change. But as the One Love Foundation points out, that hope is often just another part of the cycle of abuse.
You mean the honeymoon phase when things kind of calm down?
Yeah.
They apologize and say it won't happen again?
Exactly. It's like this messed up reward system. You get those little bits of kindness, the apologies, the affection, and you hold on to that and hope for more, even though the bad times are so much worse.
It's like getting crumbs when you're starving.
Wow, that's a good way to put it. It really shows how abuse can make you see things differently and make you hold on to something that's actually hurting you.
So we've covered a lot on the emotional side. Fear, low self-esteem, denial, guilt, shame, and hope.
It's heavy stuff.
It really is. What about the situational reasons, those external things can make it so hard to leave?
Well, financial dependence is a big one. If the abuser controls the money, it can be really hard to imagine leaving and supporting yourself, especially if you have kids.
Right.
You're basically stuck relying on the person who's hurting you.
Yeah, that makes sense. But even if you're not financially dependent, there are other kinds of dependence that can be just as powerful.
Absolutely. Like, what if the abuser has isolated you from your friends and family?
Oh, yeah. You've lost that support system. You don't have anyone to turn to.
You might literally have nowhere to go.
In the Institute for Family Studies article, there was a story about a woman who stayed because her husband threatened to hurt her loved ones if she tried to leave.
It's scary to think that for some people, staying might feel like the only way to protect themselves and the people they care about. And it's not just about physical safety either.
Right.
Some people stay to protect their children from a broken home or because of the stigma around divorce.
Yeah. Psychology Today talked about how cultural and religious expectations can also make it difficult to leave. In some communities, there's a lot of shame associated with divorce.
Exactly.
It can make it even harder to talk about it or to get help.
Yeah, for sure. And we can't forget those facing even more barriers because of a disability or their immigration status. Imagine being dependent on your abuser for care because of a disability or being undocumented and scared that if you report the abuse, you'll get deported.
So many different layers to all of this.
It's a lot, and it makes leaving an abusive relationship feel almost impossible.
Yeah, I'm getting that feeling.
But before we get too overwhelmed, it's important to remember that abuse isn't just a one-time thing. It often happens in a cycle.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Both the One Love Foundation and Psych Central talk about this cycle of abuse.
Yeah.
It usually starts with a tension-building phase where things feel really strained and you can kind of feel it coming.
It's like you're walking on eggshells, just waiting for something to happen.
Exactly. And then that tension builds up until there's some kind of explosion, whether it's verbal, emotional, or physical.
Yeah, so that's when things get really bad.
That's when the abuser kind of loses control. And then what happens after that?
Well, a lot of times there's a honeymoon phase, right?
Exactly.
Where they're super apologetic and they promise it won't happen again.
And they're affectionate and they promise things will be different.
But it does happen again.
It does.
It's this awful cycle.
This is that cycle tension, explosion, and then kind of this temporary reconciliation.
Yeah.
And it can be really confusing and manipulative. The victim is always on edge, hoping for the best, but also waiting for the next bad thing to happen.
And that hope we talked about earlier, the hope for change, can actually keep them trapped.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They keep waiting for that honeymoon phase to last, even though they probably know that it won't.
So we've talked about why it's so hard to leave, both emotionally and situationally. But we can't forget about how much this affects the victim.
It's devastating, truly devastating. The Psych Central article lists all these different ways abuse affects people mentally and emotionally. Anxiety, depression, PTSD, low self-worth.
It's like the wounds you can't see can be just as bad as physical ones.
Absolutely. I think we need to talk about one form of emotional abuse specifically, and that's gaslighting.
Gaslighting.
Yeah, gaslighting is when the abuser twists reality and makes the victim question their own sanity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it can really mess with someone's head.
I saw that one person in the Reddit thread said they felt like they were going crazy because their partner would twist everything around and deny what actually happened.
It's a scary tactic.
Yeah.
It's a form of psychological warfare, really. It can make it almost impossible for the victim to trust their own judgment. We need to understand how damaging gaslighting is, because it can make it even harder for someone to see they're being abused and reach out for help.
So we've talked about why just leave isn't a real answer and all the reasons why someone might stay emotionally and situationally.
Right.
And now we're talking about the effects of abuse, especially gaslighting.
Big.
But we also need to remember that this isn't about excusing the abuser or blaming the victim.
Of course not.
Right.
This is about understanding so we can offer better support.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's about empowering victims to make their own choices.
Okay. So that's actually a perfect segue into what we'll talk about next. How can we help?
That's what we're going to get into next.
We're going to shift from the why do they stay question to how can we help? Because ultimately, it's about creating a world where people feel safe and supported so they can leave if and when they are ready.
Right.
But we'll save that conversation for part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay.
So stay tuned for that. Okay, so we've spent a good amount of time trying to understand why it's so hard to leave an abusive relationship. But now, I really want to dig into how we can actually help. But it feels a little tricky because the wrong kind of help can actually be harmful, you know?
Oh, you're absolutely right. We can't just jump in with that just leave mentality. That completely misses everything we've been talking about. We have to focus on creating a space where survivors feel supported and empowered to make their own choices.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? Where do we even start?
I think the most important thing is listening without judgment. When someone is brave enough to share their experience, the most important thing we can do is believe them and validate their feelings. So often they've been gaslighted and manipulated so much that they don't even trust their own perceptions anymore.
Yeah, a lot of the articles we read brought that up, the importance of believing survivors. It's like that validation can be the first step in helping them reclaim their own reality.
Exactly. It tells them that they're not alone, that their experiences are real, and that they deserve support, and that support can look like a lot of different things.
Yeah, the Psych Central article had a whole list of resources,
hmm
hotlines, shelters, support groups, therapy. There are a lot of places people can turn to for help.
There are, and it's good to remember that support doesn't have to be some big, dramatic thing. Sometimes just small acts of kindness can make the biggest difference. Just being there to listen, offering to help with childcare, giving them a safe place to stay, even just being a shoulder to cry on. These things might seem small, but they can be lifelines for someone who's feeling trapped and isolated.
Yeah, it's about being there for them in whatever ways we can without trying to force them into making a specific decision or like imposing our own solutions on them.
Yeah.
I think it was the Institute for Family Studies that made a really good point about how we can also model healthy relationships for people.
Mhm.
Sometimes just seeing what a respectful and supportive partnership looks like can make a big impact, especially for someone who's only ever known abuse.
Right. It's like planting a seed,
Yeah.
showing them that a different kind of relationship is actually possible. And then, even bigger picture, I think we need to challenge those societal norms that kind of make it okay to blame the victim and romanticize all those unhealthy relationship dynamics.
Totally. We have to stop with this whole glorifying of the ride or die kind of relationship where loyalty means you just put up with anything.
Right. The Canadian Women's Foundation article was really good on this point. They talked about those harmful messages that pressure women to stay no matter what. We should be celebrating strength and resilience in walking away from abuse, not shaming people for choosing their own safety.
It's like we need a whole new script for relationships, one that prioritizes respect and boundaries and mutual support instead of this blind loyalty and self-sacrifice.
Absolutely. And part of that is thinking about the language we use. The Canadian Women's Foundation suggested we need to change the questions we ask. So instead of asking, why doesn't she just leave? We should be asking, why is he abusive? Or how can we support her to be safe?
That's such a good point. It puts the focus where it belongs on the abuser's actions and on supporting the victim, not blaming them. It also brings up this idea of collective responsibility. It's not just on the victim to fix things, it's on all of us to create a culture where abuse isn't tolerated.
Right. And part of that is knowing what resources are out there and how to intervene safely. Have you heard of the Signal for Help?
No, what's that?
The National Domestic Violence Hotline talks about it. It's the simple hand gesture that someone can use if they're on a video call or even in person to signal that they need help. You tuck your thumb into your palm and then close your fingers over it, like you're trapping your thumb in a fist.
Oh, that's really smart. It's so subtle, but such a powerful way for someone to ask for help, especially if they're in a situation where they can't really talk freely.
Exactly. It's a great example of a tool that gives people a way to reach out for help, even when things are really difficult. And it's something everyone can learn about and be aware of. A lot of times people want to help, but they just don't know how.
Right. But knowing about the signal for help, that's something everyone can do. So we've talked about listening, believing, offering practical and emotional support, showing people what healthy relationships look like, pushing back against those harmful norms, and being aware of resources like the signal for help. Is there anything else we can do to help create a culture that doesn't allow abuse to happen?
I think one of the biggest things is just talking about it. The more we talk about abuse, the more we break down the stigma and shame around it. And that can make a huge difference in encouraging people to come forward and get help.
Going through that Reddit thread, I noticed how many people said they stayed because they were afraid of what other people would think. They were scared of being judged if they left.
It's really sad. That fear of judgment can be so isolating, and it stops people from getting the support they need. We need to create spaces where people feel safe to share their stories without being blamed or shamed.
It's about creating a space of empathy and understanding, recognizing that abuse can happen to anyone and that leaving isn't always a one-time thing. It's a process. The Psych Central article mentioned that the average person in an abusive relationship will try to leave 7 times before they finally break free.
7 times! Wow! That really shows how complicated and difficult this is. It's not about weakness or being indecisive. It's about navigating a really complex situation with fear, manipulation, and all these deeply ingrained patterns.
And it really shows why ongoing support is so important. Leaving is rarely a straight line. There will be bumps in the road, moments of doubt, maybe even times when they go back. But that doesn't mean we give up on them.
Exactly. It's about being there unconditionally, recognizing that healing takes time, and celebrating every step they take toward reclaiming their lives.
Okay, so we've talked about why people stay and how we can shift our focus to supporting survivors. But it feels like there's this bigger question looming over all of this. How do we actually change those deep-seated societal norms that let abuse flourish in the first place? That feels like the real key to creating real, lasting change.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? How do we actually change those really deep-rooted societal norms that just allow abuse to keep happening? It feels almost impossible.
It is a huge challenge, that's for sure. But I don't think it's something we can't overcome. One thing that stuck with me from the Somerset Domestic Abuse Services article was that understanding why people stay is super important for offering support, but it's also really important for prevention.
So like a two-pronged approach. Support those who are experiencing it now, but at the same time, work on changing those bigger systems and attitudes that allow it to happen in the first place.
Exactly. And I think one of the most powerful things we can do is education. We need to start teaching young people about healthy relationships, what to watch out for, the red flags, and how important consent is.
It's interesting because several of the sources we looked at mentioned that people who grow up seeing abuse often don't even recognize it in their own relationships. It just becomes their normal.
That's why it's so important to intervene early. If we can give young people the tools to identify those unhealthy patterns and to get help, we can stop those cycles of abuse before they even begin.
It's like giving them a map to healthy relationships so they don't end up lost in the same toxic stuff they saw growing up.
Exactly.
But it's not just about kids, right?
Oh, definitely not. We need to be talking to adults about this too.
Yeah.
We need to push back against those ideas that make people downplay or excuse abusive behavior. Like you see it all the time in movies, right? Where they make jealousy seem romantic or songs that celebrate possessiveness and control. We need to break those messages down and show people what real love and respect are actually like.
It makes me think about that Reddit thread again. How many people said they were afraid to leave because of what other people would think?
It's heartbreaking,
Right.
but that's a very real fear. Especially for women, there's so much pressure to keep up this appearance of a happy relationship, even if it's falling apart in private.
It's like we care more about how things look than how they actually are. We'd rather pretend everything's fine than deal with the potential shame of admitting something's wrong.
And that silence just protects the abuser. It lets them keep doing what they're doing, and the victim feels totally trapped and alone.
So a big part of the solution is creating a space where people feel safe enough to come forward without worrying about being judged or blamed. But that sounds like a huge cultural shift.
It is.
How do we actually make that happen?
It starts with those small acts of courage and compassion. Being the friend who listens without judgment, the family member who offers a safe place to stay, the coworker who says something when they see something wrong.
Yeah, those everyday things that start to chip away at the silence and stigma around abuse.
Right. It's about believing survivors and making their voices heard. It's about holding abusers accountable.
Yeah.
It's about understanding that abuse thrives in secrecy and silence, and that every single one of us has a role to play in breaking that cycle.
So in this deep dive, we've talked about why people stay in abusive relationships, how to support survivors, and ultimately, how to try and stop it from happening in the first place. It's been a really heavy topic, but an incredibly important one.
I agree.
Anything else you'd like to add before we finish up?
This whole conversation has me thinking about this quote by Maya Angelou: when you know better, you do better.
I love that.
I really believe knowledge is power. The more we learn about abuse, the better we can challenge it, support those who are hurting, and create a world where love doesn't mean pain.
That's a really powerful thought, and I hope anyone listening to this comes away feeling more empowered, not overwhelmed.
Me too. Every time we have these conversations, every action we take, every time we push back against harmful norms, it all adds up and creates real change.
So I hope that as you go about your day, you'll think about this. What small, courageous thing can you do? How can you help create a world where abuse is unacceptable, where all relationships are built on respect and love, and where everyone feels safe, valued, and free to be themselves?
That's the kind of world we're working towards. A world where no one has to ask, why don't they just leave?
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. We hope it's given you as much to think about as it has for us.
Absolutely. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay compassionate.